Yeah, this is Radio TV Phono Nut, and wasn't going to do a video on this, but I decided to go ahead and do one. We've got an Audiotronics 312T all-transistor classroom record player. This is from early 1968, I believe, based on some date codes that I'm finding. I've already cleaned and lubricated the drive mechanism. Didn't feel the need to show any of that since I've done it 100,000 times. Had to replace the grommet on the back of the tone arm back here. The one on there was all deformed. Of course, the 89T cartridge was bad. I had to replace that out of one from my stock, and those are getting hard to find, especially the kind with LP and 78 flip needles. I noticed the VM site got some in stock, but you know, they're kind of pricey. They're not $5 anymore. They're anywhere between $20 and $35, depending on the type you get, with the diamond tip LP and 78 on the flip being the most expensive. I've still got to glue this platter mat down and got to fix this tone arm lock. It's messed up. Now, at the time this was made, Audiotronics was in a transition period between tube and solid state. In fact, during the time this was made, they were manufacturing models with the single 6T9 Compactron tube. They were manufacturing models with the first generation solid state amp, and they were manufacturing models with the second generation solid state amp. Now, the first generation solid state amp is all built on a metal chassis, just like what a tube model would have, and I'll show you that in this one in just a minute. The second generation solid state amp was hand wired, but it had terminal strips riveted to the motor board, underside of the motor board, and everything was wired point to point from the terminal strips, and the audio output transistors were attached directly to the motor board here. As you can see, this particular motor board is already drilled for the audio output transistors that would be mounted here if this were a second generation solid state model. But this one has the first generation solid state amp in it. And what's strange is I have a tube type Audiotronics, probably one of the last ones. It's a year newer than this one, and it also has the drill holes in the motor board for the transistors. Alright, let's pull the motor board and have a look at the amp. Alright, here's the amplifier. A couple of TO3 cased RCA transistors there on the chassis. Big filter can. Here's the underside of the chassis. I've already started replacing capacitors, and I'm going to show you the difference between a neater repair and one that's not so neat. Now, originally this had axial lead capacitors like this one here that I haven't changed, and it's getting to the point where these types of electrolytics are getting kind of hard to find. Everything now, for the most part, is the radio lead caps. And the problem with that is the leads are often not long enough to replace one of these axial lead caps, so you end up J-hooking them in place. And this is a lot of what I see when I get something in that's been previously. I see something like this right here, and yes, I did this on purpose for the sake of this video. Now, yes, this will work, but number one, it looks kind of sloppy. And number two, there's a chance that over time and, you know, the unit getting vibrated and whatnot, these leads could shift in position and short out to something, and that could cause problems. And you see here how flimsy and flexible that is. Now let me show you a neater method to do this. Here's the speaker coupling capacitor, and I'll show you why I changed these in just a minute. I didn't just change them for the sake of doing it. Now, we still had to J-hook this one, but we did it in a neater way. We simply ran heat shrink over most of the existing capacitor lead, took some scrap component lead, and attached it to the end of the existing capacitor lead here, and then ran a bigger piece of heat shrink down over that solder joint, and then placed a smaller piece of heat shrink over the extension lead, and then soldered it directly to the terminal strip in which the old capacitor was soldered. Now for my extension lead, I have a lot of old carbon composition resistors that are out of tolerance, and some of them are nice 2-watt jobs that have nice stout leads on them that are hard to bend, and that's really what we need for this application. So that's what I used for my extension leads here. Now let me show you why I replaced those capacitors. Here are the 2 little blue ones. I could have probably got by with leaving them. The capacitance value measures pretty close, and the ESR is a bit high, but you know, nothing earth-shattering. But I went ahead and changed them anyway. Here's the 1000 microfarad coupling cap for the speaker. It's date coded September 66, so it's a little bit older than the rest of the unit. The ESR value checks good. The capacitance value checks in at about 1200, which usually these are a bit high anyway, but this one is leaking electrolyte, as you can see there. And when they start leaking like that, you might as well just go ahead and get rid of them, because they don't have long for this world. And yeah, that is fluid. That's not a dried up blob of something. That is fluid leaking out of here. So just go ahead and get rid of it, because it's just going to cause trouble down the road. Alright, now what I'm going to do is go ahead and take these out and put them in more correctly. And yeah, the reason a lot of people do it this way is because it's less time consuming. You can do this in a couple of minutes versus 10, 20, 30 minutes to do it the right way, depending on how non-cooperative things want to be. But personally, I think it's better to do it the right way. And then if somebody pulls the chassis out down the road, or if you're trying to sell this and somebody wants to see an underside picture of the chassis, which I wouldn't blame them, given some of the hack repair work that I've seen, you know, you can do it right, and then you can show them a picture of the underside of the chassis with great pride, knowing that you repaired the set correctly. I know there's a seller on eBay. I'm not going to mention his name, but he sells a lot of quote-unquote restored record players and radios on eBay for ridiculous prices, in my opinion. And some of the under-chassis pictures that he's shown, I would be ashamed to even show those pictures, especially for the prices that I was charging. You know, if I'm going to charge $300, $400, $500 for a record player, which I'm not going to do, but if I was going to do that, I wouldn't be showing pictures of replacement part leads just running every which way and in danger of touching stuff, and electrolytic capacitors bridged across old electrolytic capacitors, and even old capacitors left in circuit. I would not do that. If you're going to charge that kind of price for something, and then your work needs to match it. Okay, viola. That looks a lot neater, doesn't it? Now this capacitor here was originally an axle cap that positive went here, ground went all the way over here to the chassis, to this terminal lug. Well, we have smaller and newer capacitors now, so we were able to connect positive here and ground to this terminal lug, so that's nice. And I put heat shrink tubing on the leads just in case, and it's in there nice and secure. It's not going anywhere. I checked this main filter capacitor and it's perfectly fine, so we're not gonna replace that. In fact, really the only capacitor that really needed replacing was this leaking output coupling capacitor there. The rest of them were still pretty well okay, but I just went ahead and got rid of them anyway. And go from
fooled me. Over and over.
One of the things I like about these Audiotronics models is the tone control. Most models just have a simple treble cut control, but this one has what they call tone balance. When turned all the way to the left, you have treble and no bass. When turned all the way to the right, you have full-on bass and no treble, and when you set it to the middle position, the sound is sort of balanced out. You have equal treble and bass, so that's nice. Yeah, Teresa Brewer covering a Fats Domino song. Yeah, this has got a nice sound to it, which most of these old classroom record players had a nice sound to them.
I don't know, 'cause I have a sad story to tell.
Yep, very good. Well, that takes care of the electronic and mechanical detail of this. Now all we have to do is glue this back on, and I need to repair one of the spring-loaded feet that's broken, and I need to repair this tone arm lock. Yes, you can still lock it to the tone arm rest, but it's not supposed to wiggle and wobble around like that, so we're going to have to do something to fix that. And then we should be able to put this thing back together, and it'd be good to go for another several decades. Okay, one other thing I want to do is make this diode installation a little neater. This was indeed a factory job, but we can shorten these leads a good bit and it look a little bit neater and lessen the chances of one of these leads actually shorting out to anything. Just for the heck of it, I just went ahead and replaced this old filter capacitor, even though it checks just fine. You know, when you get ready to get rid of something, people just love to hear the word all electrolytic capacitors changed. The original was a 2000. I didn't have that, so I paralleled a 1500 and a 470 together, and you see how I did it. Grounded the capacitor directly to the chassis and wired the positive ends to this terminal strip here, or this terminal lug, and then connected our diode and our B plus lead to the rest of the amplifier right there, and it's nice and tight, not going anywhere. And I'll probably put a little glue on these capacitors to hold them to the chassis just for extra measure. Many of these record players have these spring-loaded feet on the bottom, and that way if the record player is jarred, it'll help prevent needle skips. The earlier ones had all metal feet on them, and those seemed to hold up okay, but by the late 60s they'd started using these all plastic feet except for the springs. You can see how they're mounted. The spring, the bottom of the foot assembly is held in the cabinet by these little plastic things here, and you put the spring in and then push this top piece down and then turn it so it'll stay in place. Well, what happens over time, sometimes the little plastic ears on this top piece here will break off, and then the top piece will come off, and then the spring comes out, and then the whole bottom of the foot comes out. If you're lucky, all of those pieces will still be rolling around inside the record player, but more often than not, some piece is going to be missing, and that's where these old junker record players come in. I came up with a spring and a retainer ring to fix the broken retainer ring that was here. But yeah, this record player here is an old Valiant brand from the early 70s. It's one that I actually got going, and I wasn't really impressed with the sound quality, and then it stayed in my storage for several years and got moldy and dirty, and and a rat got in my storage space and ate some of the covering off of it, so I said, what the heck, it wasn't no good anyway, so I'll just part it out. And I've already used the tone arm on something else, and probably going to use the speaker in something else, and so yeah, there you go. And also, the speakers in most of these are mounted on springs, so as to help prevent feedback. Here's the amplifier all fixed up and ready to go, and had to tape the tone arm wire to the chassis like they originally had it done, because if I didn't tape it, the outer shield covering could very easily come in contact with this connection on this fuse here, and we certainly wouldn't want that to happen. Alright, I'm about ready to put it back in the cabinet, and we're almost done with this. Alright, here we are all back together and cleaned up. This one's in relatively good shape. Got a little number wrote there on the Audiotronics badge, but no typical school scribbling anywhere else. And here comes the Crosley spy plane again. They don't like to see me working on vintage record players. They're afraid that's going to hurt their business. Alright, a little bit of rust on one of the lid hinges, but other than that, this thing's in pretty good shape. But yeah, Crosley don't like me putting the vintage bug in people's head. They want you to they want people to think that vintage stuff is old and inferior to today's modern technology, so that's why if you want to enjoy the best vinyl experience possible, you should buy one of their new Chinese record players. And if you ever find one of these Audiotronics all-transistor record players, and if you want to know what amp is in it before you buy it, in case you're looking for one of the first generation models with the hand-wired amp, turn it upside down and look under here. There'll be a screw right here on the right hand side of the player. There'll be a screw on the underside. If it has the hand-wired amp, it's built on a tube style chassis. The second generation solid state model that has the terminal strips riveted to the motor board with everything wired point to point on terminal strips does not have this screw here. And the very first solid state models from 64 and into 65 actually still have the removable grill on the bottom that the tube models had for easy access to the tubes. But as you can see, this one here doesn't have that. But like I just said, the earliest solid state models do. They were still using tube cases, and they still had the removable bottom grill that you could remove to access the tube on the vacuum tube models. Here's the speaker out of that Valiant record player that I'm parting out, made in Holland. But I'm going to hang on to it because I'm always needing good replacement 6x9 speakers for these school record players and such, and occasionally in radios, and it's getting hard to find these old style high efficiency, what I call vacuum tube era speakers that will get loud with low power input. Pretty much what I'm finding today in the 6x9 variety is big honking car speakers that are rated for 400 watts, and those are just really not very efficient enough to work on this older low powered equipment. In fact, speakers of any kind, if they're not damaged, you need to save them, because I don't care what size they are. It's just getting hard to find the good old school type speakers anymore. And the few that are made today are usually Chinese crap that sound horrible, so, there you go.
Because I love you. Yes, for myself.
Okay, not quite finished with Audiotronics yet. I've been using this to listen to LPs and 45s and have been quite happy with it. Well, I decided last night to listen to a 78, so I flipped the cartridge around to the 78 side, placed the needle on the record, and no sound. And the first thought that came to mind was one of the cartridge wires had broken loose, and sure enough, that's what happened. And that seems to be a common problem on these classroom record players and on the consumer grade record players, where the cartridge is a turnover type instead of just the needle being a flip type. Because whenever you turn the cartridge over, it moves the wires and places stress on the wires. Every time you turn the cartridge, it places just a little bit more stress on the wires and the connections, and eventually they're going to break off. So what I usually do on these is run a piece of heat shrink tubing over the wires, solder them back to the cartridge, and then run the heat shrink over the connection and then shrink it up, and that'll act as a bit of a strain relief. That's really a bad design the way they did that, and if I could get away with installing a Fansteel P228 cartridge, which is stationary, only the needle flips, I'd do that. On some classroom record players I've done just that very thing too, but I was able to figure out how to get a little more gain out of the amplifier, because these just don't sound right with anything other than an 89T cartridge unless you modify it. And on this particular series of record players, I haven't figured out how to modify the amp for more gain, so we're just going to stick with an 89T. Alright, I just taped down the tone arm wire with masking tape like they had it done originally to keep this from moving and touching something it's not supposed to touch, like this fuse holder here. And I fixed the tone arm lock. I found another nut to replace the missing one, and just to be safe, I used a little bit of JB weld to hold it in place. That way we won't ever have to worry about it coming loose again. And this is not something that I can foresee anyone wanting or needing to take off with a tone arm, so that should be no problem there. And as you can see, that's indeed what happened here. The red wire just broke off. So we got to take this holder out and resolder it. Yep, and the braided wire is just about to snap too. So yeah, it's a good thing this happened to me before I let this thing go to somebody, because that would have messed up our days for me and whoever this winds up with. So better that I find it now and fix it than have to worry about it later. And on these types of players, I just need to include this as part of my service routine. Just go ahead and resolder and redress the cartridge connectors while you're at it, and that way you won't have to worry about it later. Or I won't have to worry about it later, or we won't have to worry about it later, or whatever. Alright, there we are, soldered back up. That was a bit of a tedious job, but it's done now, and heat shrink tubing over the leads, so that'll provide a little bit of strain relief. Yeah, I guess that's one advantage to the 21st century versions of the 89T cartridge, where you have a green single-sided 78 cartridge and a red single-sided LP cartridge. You just unplug one and plug the other one in for the different types of records you want to play, and there's no strain on the wires from flipping the holder back and forth. Of course, the disadvantage to that is it's easy to lose the cartridges or to damage them, like if you accidentally drop one of them and step on it or whatever. And also, I don't care for those little red LP cartridges. The green 78 ones, I've used those a lot without any trouble, but the red LP cartridges I don't particularly care for, because they don't track well, they don't sound that great, and they'll only play one side of a stereo record, whereas the original type 89T combines both the left and right channel to give you a mono signal. But on the newer red cartridges, you only get one channel of a stereo record that's reproduced, and I don't like that either. And these original statics are getting scarce. Well, the phone rang and dark caught us, but here we are with a 78. Turn that down a minute.
I am depressed, yet resurrected.
Alright, that sounds good. I'll flip it back over to LP and we still have activity. So this one I believe is ready to go.